Good morning, everyone. What we're going to speak today is about the fundamental differences in the sense of suffering between Christianity and Judaism. It's very important to make a very clear statement. When we use the word Christianity, we can say Catholic and Protestant, because those are two broad divisions in Christianity. And when we speak about the concept of suffering within Christianity, as you know, there are many denominations. There are basically two main views regarding to the timing of what happened to Christian souls at death and the whole concept of suffering in the afterlife. So we'll start with the point of departure of the afterlife suffering in Christianity, and then we go to the general suffering in Christianity, and then we juxtapose to what Judaism stands for. So the two main views, the first one is what happened to Christian souls after death. They either immediately join all the other believers, Christians with gods, and which they call the Jesus and the Holy Ghosts, and in heaven, or in the other view, the souls of the deceased have which they call a waiting period, and will be rejoined with the other resurrected bodies at the second coming of Jesus, and then will descend to heaven. So there is in that view, the whole concept of suffering means that those who are non-believers, of course, go right away to hell in their view. Now, under that point of the waiting period view, the Catholics have the concept of, very concept of Purgatory, which means that there is a certain process of cleansing, which in a sense is a time of suffering for those souls that not virtuous enough to go straight way to heaven. And prayer in their mind, prayer for these souls are helpful to aid their getting to heaven, which means that there is a view among some Protestants that the soul is with the body until the second coming, but I think that most believe that the soul go right to heaven. That's in my best knowledge. So in other words, in a very general term, and don't misconstrue the previous several lectures, there is no endless cycle of reincarnation for repairing the soul in Christianity. What we talked was about Buddhism, not Christianity. And as far as the biblical evidence, in their understanding, there are some resurrections in the Bible. I'm just referring to the previous talk, that these are souls of returning to the same body. And it's a few possible reincarnations in very notable figures in the Bible, like the famous story they have about Elijah return as John the Baptist, or simply the illusion to the fact that they are both prophets, and not everyone take it seriously, but because in that message of John was so really in so many branches in Christianity, it's basically rejected. But these instances from the scripture, it's not become part of the doctrine of Christianity that indicate any type of reincarnation in the sense of process of suffering or process of repairing. So of course, this is very important to know before we go further with the concept of suffering, that the whole idea of in Christianity, souls are not reincarnated in general, which means they go to be with God immediately or with a delay, but not to return to earth, as we said in Judaism, transmigrated or reincarnated in Buddhism as a being. With that in mind, what basically Christianity speaks about, it's first in a general term, it's the man was born to a sin, which I assume you all heard. The whole idea of the first sin and the biblical genesis of Adam and Eve, it's a very well-known concept in Catholic dogma and what Protestants believe. For sure, over the development in Christianity, things and the approach change, especially in the more we go to the time of the Great Renaissance, which is a big rethinking out of box in the main dogma of the church. Things change. So, in other words, the whole idea of the first sin of man was something that creates the human suffering, and accepted a need in order to reach a point of repairing the first sin. That's the first approach. Later in the development of I'll use the word the Christianity, but I meant by that the Catholicism and Protestants in general. It's the development of the Crusade time or the Great Inquisition's time that they take the whole concept of suffering, the idea of people needs to go to a self-improvement or self-suffering in order to reach a point of repairing either early sins or the death of Jesus. So in other words, if you read their literature, they speak even against those who have all type of formula, meditative formula or medicine that fight against pain. They basically oppose it because they felt that that's a part of need in order to endure suffering and even encourage suffering. So the whole idea of people need to go to a period of suffering is in their literature part of the purgatory. For example, in Catholicism, the purgatory doesn't need to go after life. It can go doing the living life of a person in order to reach some level of connectedness to the Trinity, or connected to the whole idea of the originated dogma of the deity. So the whole idea of the process is to purify the sinner, to purify the disbeliever, and some go to a great agony, and that basically part of the either Jesus' blood or the blood that relates to his or the suffering. There is another very big school of thought that developed during the great era of the 15th, 16th century in the church, which is the Great Renaissance. At that time it was a rethinking, and they start thinking about suffering as a punishment for the current sins. If you read the literature of, for example, of Jean Paul or Descartes or others, they speak about some type of warning point that came down from heaven as a helpful point for people to feel connected to their sins. The problem that some modern Christianity have with that is the whole idea of by enduring to that and you changing your perception on life or changing your opinion or virtue of life, it's still you still carry the pain of suffering, which means the whole concept of pain of suffering not disappear by the, for example, the Sufi idea of tuba, of making teshuvah in Hebrew, or like changing your way for better. That's not something that Christianity agree upon, that changing a person's physical mode or mental mode. The concept of suffering in Christianity apply not only to a physical suffering, but more broad-minded the suffering of the mind. And the suffering of the mind is connected to all these components. Either the school of thought that you go to a person's sin, either during his or her lifetime or afterlife in order to reach a level of being together with the Lord, Or you have another school of thought that apply if it's not the person's himself life, like you take the nun or the people who are basically live in a state of seclusion from society and they dedicate themselves to service of the Lord, they still, there is a school of thought that they, some suffering connected to much earlier sins, which is the general sins, the previous sins, the sins relate to crucifixion, so earlier the sins of the first man. So as you see, this type of thinking, you can see the perception not only of suffering in this life or afterlife, but Christianity deal with suffering in a perception of physical, that connected to a mental suffering, but it's all not necessarily connect to a person's action. It can be, in a modern school of thought, it can be, but it's always not only. It means that it's connected to something broader than the person's actions in life. However, in Judaism, we take the concept of suffering in a very different perception. So in order to go to understand Jewish thinking of suffering, we again need to trace back a little bit in the history. Most of the time, if you look at the Jewish history from the very beginning, which we are speaking about a couple of thousands of years, all this concept of the Jewish exile show that most of the time the Jewish people not live in the land. So the Jewish people dealing most of the time with the mystical text, which is some literature that's written in different language that the language people live, such as different than Aramaic, different than Spanish, different than all kind of those countries that Jewish people dwell over the times. Yet they are connected to something broader, more mystical part, that it's connected to something else, some type of dream about better life in the redemption. But as long as in a state of exile, there is a concept that it's called eschatology, which means that feeling constantly a need that of yearning to redemption, and because the Jewish people are alienated, this concept of alienation within the Jewish thinking, we are alienated from our home, this part created this type of yearning and feeling of suffering. The suffering as a nation in general, it's a suffering because of disconnectedness from the original language and the land. In a simple method, the Jewish people feel in their writings that the part of the general suffering is connected to something broader than the personal endowment of struggle. Take, for example, the writing of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon. It was a great rabbi that lived during the 10th century, and he wrote very similar to the great French writing of Jean Paul, and he explains the whole concept of exile and suffering. It's because lack of language, lack of sovereignty, lack of feeling connectedness to the land that they dwell, can be, again, in all different places, from Yemen to Iraq to Morocco to all these countries, to French, to Germany and Poland and Spain, and all these different places that Jewish people dwell. And it's a feeling that the suffering as a nation, it's because you're not connected to your roots, which is your land and your language. The big developer on that is the great Maharal of Prague, the great Rabbi Yehuda Levi in Prague, who wrote extensively about Jewish suffering, first and foremost because of those point of alienation, lack of sovereignty and lack of language. Later, the scholar, great scholar Frank Rosenzweig in the University of Berlin developed this Maharal teaching, and he explained that the exile from a land, it's not just a cultural shock, but it's a national trauma that created this mindset of alienation, and then nothing makes us happy in a sense of nation, since we are alienated from our language and land. This led to a very deep research of what is that mean sovereignty, and why the Jews are in exile. Because there is a very serious school of thought in Judaism that said that if you tell me the exile is to embetter the Jewish people, are we really better people after Hitler than we are before, for example? Are we really a better people after we go to all different persecution as a people? That's a very serious school of discussion and thought among Jewish scholars throughout generation, regardless if those scholars are observant Jews or great rabbis. The Jews who needs to live with a feeling of alienation in different countries and being part of sovereignty, for example, in the Western culture with the Christianity, it was a big question of a covenant. The Jewish people hold that it was an ancient covenant in Genesis between God and the Israelite. But all these great Jewish writings and great scholarship, unlike all the other nations, it's uncomparable to any other nation. All the Jewish great scholarship and writing happened during the time of suffering in different land, in different nations. Which means this is like almost a prescripted formula that Jews were suffering, Jews in a great trauma, Jews in a great poverty, the greatest scholarship come out of the Jews. So as far as the nations, the perception of the Jewish thought is a mindset, analog of mindset, is more idea of eschatology, which means that every single day you are like receiving a new letter that will change your life, and the new letter speaks about Mashiach, about Messianic era, that it's just here around the corner, is about to come, and you return to your land, you return to your language, you return to yourself. So Jews throughout generation were seeking redemption. Even in ancient time, King David talked about in the book of Psalms about all these dreams of being in a nation. And again, if you try to compare to Christianity, so you see right away that their perception of Jewish suffering, it's because of the rejection of Jesus, versus the Jewish perception of suffering as lack of sovereignty and lack of recognition as their language. So alienation is the Jewish perception of suffering as a nation. Individually, the rabbi said, and again we're just touching the surface, that if you look at the biblical text, for example, in the book of Leviticus, the Bible speaks about leper, a person that suffers from sudden leprosy, either at his or her home or their body. So the Bible speaks about suffering as a result of a person's actions. So unethical behavior, such as speaking ill against another person or defamation of character of another person, created a concept of not just you slander that person, but you created for yourself a leprosy, which is metzorah, the leper, motzi shem ra, someone who defaming character. It's part of the development of suffering that the person created for himself. So Jewish thinking, it's basically suffering start with the person himself, not necessarily in the concept of sin, but in the concept of a person his own enemy by his own action. With that in mind, the rabbis go to a broader understanding, like the great Saadia Gaon of 10th century, who explained that the suffering is the first start with the concept of famine, which means feeling a need of something, feeling a need of something broader, which is, he speaks about several virtues, which we'll talk later. The virtue of significance, that the person needs to feel significance, the virtue of the need, the person have a need for something, the virtue for love, etc. We'll talk soon about those different virtues, but it's basically the feeling of physical starvation. It's connected to a spiritual starvation, which means spiritual starvation, by this great rabbinic writing, come from the starvation of a need to hear the word of God, which is a feeling of connectedness to the broader understanding of a person's life. Some word about Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, just to see his historical concept of life before we go to his writing of the suffering. Rabbeinu Saadia ben Yosef al-Fayyumi, he came from the city called Fayyum, and he lived at the 10th century. He was a part of a great school that was built at that time by the Caliph al-Mu'man, which is the great Caliph in Baghdad, in Iraq. That Caliph built that school at the 9th century. And in that great school, they taught, even it was Islamic culture and development of the Islam, they taught Aristotelian teaching, Plato, and much more. So in other words, this great Islam teaching that started 200 years earlier was greatly developed in Baghdad at 9th century by this Caliph al-Mu'man, and the teaching of Plato, Aristotle, and much more developed there. So, in a sense, this is a great Jewish leader that need to respond as the head of the Jewish community, Rabbeinu Saadia, to tremendous challenges that came from all different directions. One is the challenge that said that the Jewish suffering, it's because of rejection of Muhammad. Another school of thought is because of the rejection of Jesus. And here in the book of the Faith in Beliefs, speaks that in his theological approach is the lack of sovereignty, lack of the feeling of alienation, lack of language, lack of connection to the text. That's the cause of suffering. He holds that a person who is disconnected from his or her roots of life of Torah and fulfilling commandment, which is a lack of connectedness to a person's own soul, that creates the feeling of suffering, feeling of alienation. Another great rabbi that developed that thinking was the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the book called Kuzariya, the 11th century. And he speaks about living God, not a transcendental God that is above and not involved in a person's life, but it's a living God. And because this is a constant living God that develops every part of a person's life, it's a person should look at his physical life as a part of connectedness to the living God. Is God staying in my living room, or God is only in my house of worship? Is God a very important part of my life or not? In that sense, it's a little different than the Aristotelian teaching, because even Aristotelian teaching speaks about relationship with the highest power in a sense of metaphysical, but when Aristotle talks about the first cause, or he talks about God interfering with action in the world, it's a very general, not micromanagement, if we use our language. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi hold in Kuzari that God is a living, in a sense that God cares what type of shirt you're wearing today, in that sense. God cares of every single action. Again, point of history, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi did not develop it by himself. Several years earlier, at the late 10th century, early 11th century, that development of Jewish thinking and Jewish philosophy was very much in trend. Unlike the world of Kabbalah, which we'll talk later, in the concept of suffering, the great Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda, which was a great rabbinic judge in Spain, wrote in 2 books of the duty of the hearts, and he explained that there is a duty of the hearts and duties of the limbs or the bodies. Duty of the hearts, it's a spiritual. Duty of the bodies is the regular mitzvot, regular actions that the person's made. He holds the cause of suffering is lack of fulfillment of a person's responsibility, a person's duty. Duty of the ritual, for example, visiting a sick, for example, doing certain commandment, escorting the dead. That's a ritual duties. Duty of the heart apply to the I'm doing something more than just my body. I'm doing something more spiritual. my meditation instruction, my more than just a physical action of doing something in the sense almost routinely or something that very rationally. He goes further that the person can have some type of medicine that avoid those suffering, which basically physical suffering caused by mental suffering. It's by fulfilling the duty of the heart, which is what the heart needs, what type of food the heart needs in order to receive the state of happiness. With that approach of the Jewish philosophy, we need to go to another phase, which is the Kabbalah teaching over suffering, and that's a little different than philosophy. In order to understand the Kabbalah suffering, again, we need to deal a little bit in history. In the Kabbalah suffering, which start, as far as we know, the 2nd and the 3rd century, it was a literature that it's called the Heichalot literature or Merkava literature, which is for example, the first book of Ezekiel, dealing with which called in Greek the Pleroma. Pleroma meaning the Greek methodology speaks about the great king who's sitting in a throne and all these cherubim or all these chariots around him, and is electric phases around that chariot, and is a pleroma. It's a great entities that created by the king who sit in the glory, in that throne of glory, who's constantly running around him. Why it's important? The great professor Peter Scheffer in Berlin University, he wrote extensively in the whole meaning of that Heichalot and Merkava literature, which again, according to many, is a literature that developed at the 2nd and the 3rd century. It speaks about suffering because it's a lack of mysticism in a person's life, which means the great mystic have to climb a ladder of 7 different palaces, 7 Heichalot, and in that sense, each step, the mystic can develop a better understanding of his or her own suffering and deal with that in a better way. Another great scholar is a Professor Yosef Dan of the Hebrew University, which is a little different school of thought than Professor Scheffer. And he speaks in the explanation of the book of Shiur Koma, which is a book that, again, according to many, was the 2nd, 3rd century, or the book Yetzirah. In his explanation of those books, he holds this analogy of thinking about Shekhinah, about the divine providence, with the letters that the divine providence provided in the scroll of Torah, that is some type of healing for a person's life. To go a little deeper, it means that it's a school of thought that the sense of hearing the word of Torah, reading the letters of Torah, be engaged with that, they have some metaphysical effect on a person's mind and well-being. That writing was in a way almost stopped, or at least we don't have much, between 7th to 13th century. That some hold the reason of the great development of Jewish philosophy, Jewish thinking, because the great rabbi like Saadia Gaon, Bach ibn Pekuda, or even Maimonides developed their thinking at that period between the 7th to 13th century. Later, the 13th century, with the development of the Kabbalah, which is the esoteric element of understanding suffering or understanding the world, it was in Girona, it was in Provence, it was a great city of Spain, again, because of the tremendous persecution, Inquisition, and all the Jewish suffering. This reality, the Jewish people felt that as much as we are good and try to be a good neighbor and good people to the country and good people to whoever we are, yet you still see a Jewish suffering, not individually but as a community. This brought the big conflict between the school of Jewish Kabbalah and the school of Jewish philosophy. And if you look from the historical perspective, the Kabbalah won over philosophy big time. Why that happened? Because it was a constant question over Jewish suffering. If we are, as a community, a good people, and we do everything right, for example, for the Spanish government, and we have the highest power people in the Spanish government, like Don Itzhak Abarbanel, like Abraham Senior, like great Rabbeim and great scholars that involved in the treasury, in the Minister of Finance, in controlling the Spanish huge prominent country, yet all of a sudden there is decree to expel us, or is decree to persecute that. There is something to do with us as people, as much as we are good people, that we suffer. So this question of Jewish suffering is, again, you can ask that again even in 2012, that is the fact that Jewish people went through 6 million of 1.5 million of children in a Shoah, or we are better people after Hitler than we are before. So that type of painful question brought this new school of thought with Kabbalah response, that it's called the esoteric element of the Jewish suffering. In that sense, there is a idea, is a strong notion that developed very strongly in Spain in the 13th century, in Provence and Girona, and later the 16th, 17th century in Sefard, and later in Poland, the 18th, 19th century in the world of Hasidut, dealing with Neoplatonic teaching, which is new understanding that the dogma, the understanding of life, or the Jewish life first and foremost as a nation, before we're dealing individually, dealing with the esoteric part, of the hidden part, the existential part of the Torah, has something much deeper than just suffering in its virtue of daily life happening, daily agony that happened from here or from there. So if you see, several years ago it was a challenge in Iraq in our language, and then you have a challenge in Venezuela, and then you have a challenge in Iran and other places in the world. If you are really a thinker, you have to think a much broader understanding, not only look upon a certain small event in one place that you basically expunge this issue, but maybe as the issue of expanding a lice, something that spread in a different location, that the response to that, it's much broader and hidden. In a Neoplatonic teaching, there is a very deep concept in Kabbalah. Try to swing with me now. It's the concept of relationship between the above world and below world, which means that is in the above world, the world of chariot, the world of God, that carry different, in their language, ministers or different entities, and those above highly entities have some type of fight or some type of differences in the way that they serve in the highest power. And the reflection of what's happening above is connected to the people's world. This is one school of thought. So in that sense, which is a very hard concept, when a person sees a hurricane or earthquake or any terrible thing that happened in the world, it can be some type of reflection of something that happened in the world above. A small example, in the Jewish prayer, we have this famous Kaddish prayer that we recite constantly doing prayer, and especially after passing of someone, and we end up by going 3 steps backward and saying, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, may God who created peace in heaven, created peace upon all of us. Okay? So the rabbi said, when you using the statement, may God created a peace in heaven, it means that events, exposure to events you see on television, or the exposure to events you see here, do not look at those events in a small understanding of suffering is just the location, or that ruler, or that micromanagement of events in the earthly world, but it's a much higher and much broader, is a reflection of events that happen in the higher world, in the world above. And in that sense, this is very esoteric element. This is a Neoplatonic understanding of a world that above transcendental, above godly world. With that in mind, we can see that this living of the epistemology, which means the whole idea of logic that allow us to recognize and understand that there is a unity of God, the unity between the world above and the world below, that the same God controls both worlds, and you see reflections of events in the world above, in the world below, which means events that happen, it's in that sense, in that understanding, not necessarily to the specific event on earth, but it's a reflection for something goes higher. Imagine, for example, if you throw a stone on the window and the window is broke, and then those sparks that coming out of the window hits a car that's driving on the street and hurt someone. So don't look at the car accident, look at the cause of the causes, or the first cause. So in that sense, the Aristotle teaching is the same thing, that you have to look at the first cause, but a little different. Immanuel Kant, for example, who speak about God as a metaphysical and much higher, in that literature, which is very academic, scholarly literature, Kant hold that it's way above human understanding of the suffering in general. So suffering can have much broader that not always people who are limited can comprehend. However, the Kabbalah literature hold that when a person's understand that my suffering or individual suffering, it's a result of a internal war within a person's himself, eternal world with the belief in the world to come, for example, the great dichotomy between the soul and the body. This is something that Kabbalah writings or Jewish writing in general are very much encouraged. An example to that. The great Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who was the 18th century great Hasidic Rebbe that wrote extensively, he developed all this concept of Saadia Gaon and the Kuzari and the 13th century Spanish writings and 16th century Sefat writing. All of that he developed the concept that he's talk about happiness of a person. The act of happiness. How a person can be happy. So he holds that, for example, when a person's in the mood of music that he or she really likes, that music can create in a person's conscience a better feeling. Dancing, for example, makes a person happy. But all of that develop some type of interaction with a person's higher world and the world above, and therefore by being connected to those worlds, he fulfills his needs. Furthermore, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov speaks about the great virtue of people's needs. Some said, I have a need for love, or I have a need for significance. Rabbi Nachman explains that needs develop for basically 4 or even 5 great virtue. For example, if we speak about the suffering because of love, it means that the person carry a fear of rejection, and because he has a great fear of rejection, he feels suffering because he's either in a state of loneliness or in a state of unhappy. So Rabbi Nachman developed all this teaching by saying that for a person to overcome this, he has this understanding of the power of those virtues, which is its emotional state that the person have, and he needs to develop his courage or self-courage in a certain way, such as hearing a specific music, attending wedding or dancing events or happy occasions. By being involved with environment of simcha, environment of happiness, it's created in a person's mind a different state, and that hopefully develop his emotional state of encouragement, and then he will be able to be happy. In other words, in order for a person to be out of suffering, he needs to know the cause of the causes of the suffering. So since cessation is very hard, as Immanuel Kant tells us, it's very hard to comprehend, we can do something individually. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said that the person needs to have a very strong will. He needs to know what's the cause of the problem, what's the key problem of the problem, what's the best understanding of the problem. So the minute you understand that the problem is a person's need for being significant, a person have a need for love, a person have a need for termination, a person have most of all self-honesty, which means a person cannot deal with his or her own suffering if they're not honest at least with themselves, to tell themselves the truth of the truth, what's the cause of their suffering. With that in mind, a person, if he reach a point that he can focus on that, he can develop some type of encouragement by being happy. Being happy can be metaphysical, in a sense, involvement with environment of happiness, or by being physically happy, which is a development of self-honesty within himself, and recognize within himself the problem and face that problem, and not in a sense of being discouraged, but encouraged that he was able to overcome those fears. So for example, if a person has a need of significance, which most of the people has some need for significance, or the persons have a great need of love, so he needs to know that those fears, the source of love is not stress, is the fear that come from, for example, fear of rejection, or fear of something that's going to happen if I do A, B, C, D. So the goal is that a person needs to have the power, the self-courage to be able to restore to himself his ability to overcome those challenges. And the key for that, Rabbeinu Nachman hold, is the state of mind of happiness, which means if he sees the good part, what he has in his life, if he, for example, take a notebook and writes all the good events that happen to him on a daily basis and keep it, and then anytime he's down, he just retrieve those points. If you take those good memories of all the good things that he was granted in life, then he's able to reach a state of happiness. Another small point I want to make before we conclude this part is the Abulafia writing. Abulafia writing of suffering is very important to know. And again, I'm doing now absolutely something that is injustice, because it should be a separate lecture, but I'm just giving you the vignette, the main point. Abulafia was a great Kabbalist, but living in the wrong time. It's like saying that Mozart should live today, not a few hundred years ago. He was super ingenious of the 11th century Spain and Portugal, but he was one of those people who forced out. One of the reasons it's because it was tremendous innovation of scholarship. His specialty is called Chokhmat HaTziruf, the permeation of words. He was able to take the numerical values of a person's and or situations, and can use those numbers and put them together and come with some resolutions. Not magical resolution, but explanations of event in a broader understanding. He wrote extensively, he was hardly rejected, but the key point that Abulafia tried to say is very similar to some Rabbi Nachman 700 years later, which is, the key point is a person lack of perception of looking at the good part, what he has, instead of looking at the part that he doesn't have. So he basically, if you collect those items of the goods and put them together and see them properly, you are able to live in a better fulfilling lives. So what we said so far, it's to wrap up, is there are two huge gap or two huge differences between the Catholicism and Protestant teaching than the Jewish approach to suffering. Jewish approach in suffering basically said that suffering by itself, it's not possible. If God is good, if God created the world of good, and if God loved all of his children, all the creatures, God cannot create suffering for the sake of suffering. And with that in mind, the state of suffering can treated by a person himself who is able to comprehend that God is good and things are good. Now, You can ask hard questions. If I live in a ghetto, I born in Warsaw in 1905, and it's now 1939, how I'll be able to live in a state of happiness while there's so much going on? Well, you can either go by the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl, who lived during the Auschwitz and all these times and was able to treat his brain to be out of the situation and see it in a different way. In his great book, Man in Search of Meaning, he explained the whole concept of logotherapy, that even in a camp, he was able to see things in a different state of mind, and that he was able to overcome those challenges. Or you can go to the school of thought of others who hold that it's something much broader, and we can treat only things that it's in our power and our ability to treat, and not something that is above our power. But for sure, the Christianity approach as suffering by itself as a goal is strongly opposed to the Jewish teaching, who hold that there is no such a thing of suffering for the sake of suffering, or suffering of people just because something happened so many generations before that need to perpetuate. Yes, there is a concept in Bible of a golden calf and other suffering, but the rabbis in the Talmud and other locations dwell that conditional, which means it's only if the future generation hold the same pattern, the same approach as the sin of the grandparents. Otherwise, is a absolutely detachment between those sins and the current state of suffering in our lives. Thank you very much. Any question? This is your time. Yes?
You had in previous lectures talked about the Jewish concept of transmigration of the soul, and therefore there may be certain missions or possibly even some type of suffering, possibly from related to a mission unfulfilled that could cause suffering in this life. Can you talk about that and this whole notion of suffering and forgiveness in relation to that concept?
Okay, very good question. What you're asking is basically, is the suffering is part of a mission that is not completed. Well, we talk in a very broad explanation of very general suffering, mainly as a nation. Absolutely true in Judaism that there is a concept of tikkun, or completion of a previous mission. We talked several days ago the story of Purim, that the rabbis tells us that King Saul needs to get rid of the nation of Agag or Amalek. He did not complete his mission. Esther and Mordechai, his descendants, needs to do it. You can see it in Ruth's story that it was something related to much ancient time that wasn't completed. Yes, it is a lot of rabbinic literature and a lot of indirect texts that speak about suffering as an uncompleted mission, etc. But we keep saying that the suffering as a suffering has no goal, which means there is a concept of suffering when a person refuses to do what he or she is supposed to do. So it means that they created their own suffering by refusing to do what they're supposed to do. So the suffering, like the leper, because you defaming character, because you are slandering someone, you create by yourself the suffering. If a person understands that he or she is on a mission and they need to complete something and they don't do it, they created their own suffering by themselves. But the suffering itself is not created by God as a goal or virtue for people. Any question? Thank you.